everybody, it's Stephen from Web Design with .NET. Welcome to video number 2, which I'm going to call Structuring Your .NET Application Solution Architecture. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to go through the layers that I use within my .NET solutions, explain why I use those layers, what goes into those layers, and how those layers refer to each other. Specifically, I'm going to touch on ways that you can physically limit access to some layers based on the references that you use within your solution architecture. So at its core, this solution architecture that I use is based very loosely on the article that Jeffrey Palermo wrote a few years ago. He called the Onion Architecture. Now I assume he's called it that name because the way that the layers, there are a number of layers within the solution. But at its core, it relies on interfaces to expose methods so that we can separate all of our concerns as much as possible, and also allowing for unit testing to access the parts of the solution that the tests need to access to run properly. So let's jump straight into the solution. I'll just go through each of the layers. I've called this solution template, and then the layers that we have is business, data, database. Now the database layer is simply just putting the database into source control. We have a domain layer and we have a web layer. So the web layer is our UI layer. For this video, we're just going to use a web MVC layer for our UI. So let's jump into how these layers relate to each other. So our data layer, within that we have our EDMX file, which is the entity framework model file, and that's where the application can talk to our database, which I'll open, and you can see that the tables that we have in our database correspond to the entities that we have in our EDMX file. So I put that into a data model folder in our data layer. I also have a repository folder, and within that folder I have classes that essentially are the data classes. These are the classes that retrieve or write data to the database. So what I like to do is only repository classes are allowed to write to the database and pull data from the database. It means every other part of the application, if it wants to hit the database, needs to go through that data layer. And that I extend that even further. I only allow access to the data layer through the business layer. Now the business layer is where I store all of my business rules. So for each of my entities, which we saw back in the data model, I will generally create a business class. Now you can see there's two classes which have very similar names. User business is a list of methods which actually call the repository methods, and then we have an associated interface class which just exposes those methods for consumption by other layers. So what we have so far is a user repository class which can go off to the database and pull back data. It might be a single entity, it might be a list of entities, and then we have business classes which call those data methods, and then we have an interface which sits over the top of that which exposes those methods for consumption by other layers. The data layer has access to the domain layer. We'll come to that in a moment, but there's no other solution level references in our data layer. So let's collapse that. We'll jump to our business layer. Now I said that the business layer has access to the data layer, and that's where we see the reference here. It also has access to the domain layer. So we'll carry on, and hopefully some of this will make sense as we go on. So let's talk about this domain layer. What I like to use this layer for is commonly used classes or utilities or helper methods that are used throughout the solution. specifically, what I have done is from our data layer, the EDMX file generates templates. Now this is the one that I would use normally, but I've created this vanilla one that I've used the wizard for, just to show the difference. So model.edmx has 3 files within it. Template.edmx has 4. You can see that it's created a T4 template which has the same name as the EDMX. So this template actually generates the list of entities that come from the database created by Entity Framework. When we're talking about references and access, if we keep this template and its associated entities within the data layer, I said before that I don't want any other layers talking to the data layer unless it goes through the business layer. So that means if I want to do a mapping between a user and a ViewModel user in the web layer won't have access to this because it's in the data layer. So what I do is I take this template and I put it into the domain layer. So you can see that model TT file has been moved out of the data layer and moved into the domain layer. And really the only thing that I change in this is the way that it references the EDMX file. If we go back to our template, the template EDMX file is in the data model folder. If we look at the template TT file, it just references template.edmx because they both exist in the same folder. But now that I've moved this out of that folder, I have to make it go back and reference that EDMX using the correct file path. So we go back a level into template.domain, into data model to find the model.edmx. So now we have all of these entities in a common project, which is available to the data layer because we have a reference to it, the business layer because it has a reference to it, and also our web layer because it has a reference to it, as well as the business layer. So that's our domain project, and you saw from references that almost all of the other layers have access to this domain layer. So let's move along to our web project. So in our web project, we also have a need for those entity classes, but we don't necessarily want to use the same entity classes that have come directly from the EDMX file. The reason for that is, say for example, we have a list of users coming out of the database. Our user entity will have these fields, but we may want to use more than those fields in our web layer. So for example, if we have a list of users, we're showing that in a grid, we may have a select checkbox on each row for each of those users. By default, the model that gets sent to that view won't have a capacity to save that checkbox for each of the items in the grid. So what I like to do is I like to create a new class or a new entity class in the web layer, and I call that a viewModel class. So what I do is very similar to what I did with the model TT from the data layer into the domain layer. I also move, or I copy that file into the models folder of my web project. And I also give it a different name, just so there's differentiation between the two. So this one is now an MVC model T4, and you saw that this has entities within it as well, although they do look very different. Instead of them being the names of the tables from the database, they're prefixed with viewModel. The reason, or the way that I do that, if we look at this template, and we'll compare these two, they're essentially the same, except the file paths are different. You can see how that's different. But also, when I'm generating the file names, I add viewModel in front. That's done further down the file as well. We won't go into that in this video. I will touch on that in another video, but suffice to say, what we want to do is we want to create a different file name with a different namespace. See, we've actually called it a different name here so that we can differentiate between this user class and this user class. They're essentially the same, they just have different names. So let's put some of this into practice. I mentioned earlier in the business layer, we have a business class and a matching interface which sits over the top of that. We do a similar thing in our web project. Now I like to use areas, so I'll dig into this area and we'll specifically stick with the user related classes and views here. So first of all, let's look at our user viewModel builder interface because it starts prefixed with an I, which tells me that it's an interface. So if we look at this, it's a public interface, that's our name, and we're instantiating some methods called those. Now they relate to our user viewModel builder class because this class inherits from that builder class. It instantiates a new local variable called user business, and it's relating to the user business interface from our business class. You can see that there's the reference there. So with constructor injection, we're injecting the user business interface into our class, assigning it to the local variable, doing some mapping, and these are our methods that we're going to consume within our web project. So you can see here that we're setting a model to the return data of the getAllUsers method from the user business class, which is actually calling our interface. And then we're doing a mapping between what returns here, if we look at that class in our business interface method, the getAllUsers method returns an IEnumerable of user. So if we come back to our builder, the getAllUsers will return an IEnumerable of user. Now that's unusable in our web project because we want to return a list of viewModel users. So what I use is an object mapping product called AutoMapper. So here I'm creating a mapping between the viewModel user entity, which we use in our web project, and the user entity, which we use in our business and data layers. So I map that to that and the inverse of that to that so that I can pull data through from the business layer, but I can also write it back. That's the reason that we create that two-way mapping. So we have a model which is an IEnumerable of user, and we convert that to a list, and then we map that to a new list of viewModel users, and that gives us that object returned from this method. I might do another video and talk about AutoMapper and how that works in a little bit more detail, but for now I think that's all we really need to talk about with relation to AutoMapper. Similarly, instead of the list for our getUserById, we're just returning a single user. Again, we call the user business method getUserById. We pass in that variable. It returns us, if we go to it returns us a single user object. So here we now have a single user object. But again, we can't use that because we need to return a viewModel user. We map from the model to a blank viewModel user, and it takes all of the fields that match between those two objects, takes them from the business object and inserts them into the viewModel object, and we return that from this method. So now let's just talk about how we consume that. So that's our viewModel builder. There is also a similar approach in our actions within our controller. So this is our user controller. Again, we're creating a local variable, but this time we're pointing it to the user viewModel builder interface. Constructor injection, setting the local variable, and here we're saying return a list of viewModel users from the builder view get all users method. So very similar approach to what we just talked about within the viewModel builder. So now what we have is this view will be expecting a list of viewModel users to render in the view. So let's jump across to that view now. So here our model is, well, it's an IEnumerable of viewModel user, and then there's some referencing in there that we could probably tidy up as well. But essentially what we have is a list of users. We're generating our table heads and then iterating through the entire model to give us a list of rows within that table. So let's execute this view. First of all, we'll make sure there's a breakpoint there. Execute this view, and we will see what this looks like in the chain of method calls. So now we've hit our index action, and we're now going to jump across. We'll just step into this. So we're going to go to the builder. Stepping through the builder now, we're referencing the getAllUsers method from our business class, executing that, which then executes our repository class. And we'll step out of that and returning our list, which comes back to the user business, which comes back to the viewModel builder, which does our mapping and returns us to our action. So now we have a list of models. There's 19 entities within that model. So let's keep going through, and I might just let that run through to our view. So I hope that's been helpful to you. It's a brief description of how I like to structure my .NET solutions. One of the most important reasons that I use this approach is so that I can unit test all of the methods that I'm generating, because my unit tests can call the interfaces and there's no real worry about the methods that are being called, because all I do is call the interface, and if the interface is bound correctly to the builder methods, the interface will always return what I need it to return. So unit testing will work correctly. Secondly, it's also very helpful to separate your concerns, but also restrict the way that certain layers can access other layers within the application. Specifically, we're talking about the data layer. So you can see, based on the references within our solution, anytime anything wants to hit the database, it must go through the business layer. And that way all of our business rules will always get executed, and nothing can bypass those business rules. So say, for example, we have this web client that we're using here, but later on we decide that we want to use a WPF client as well. Our business rules in the business layer are already in place. All we need to do is tell our WPF client to use those business interface methods, and then all of our business rules are preserved and there's no need to rewrite anything. So that's all we have for this video. Just remember, web design with .NET is the website. We also have this podcast available on iTunes, or you can get the RSS feed from the website. And we're also on YouTube as well. So all videos that go to iTunes will also go to YouTube as well. So remember to subscribe and rate us as high as possible. 5 stars is always good on iTunes. And we'll see you next time.